Hello and welcome to today's webinar, The New Workflow Imperative, an integrated automation strategy connecting process automation to the business. I'm Teresa Resick, Director in the Market Intelligence Group here at AIIM, and AIIM is your host and producer of today's event. With me today are Neil Ward-Dutton from MWD Advisors and David Jeunesse from IBM. IBM is the underwriter of today's webinar, and we thank them for their support. And thank you for taking the time to join us today. Before we get started, I just wanted to offer a few pointers for viewing today's webinar. By joining our webinars live, you can customize your own viewing experience, so feel free to open, close, or resize the different windows. And across the bottom of your screen is a list of all of the widgets that we have available to you. And group chat is available, and you open this by clicking that group chat icon that is along the bottom. And with group chat, you will be able to text, chat with each other, and also with a few of us from here at AIIM. Do ask questions of the speakers throughout the hour using the Q&A feature, and we will hold them until the end, where we should have 5 or 10 minutes to answer them. You can also use this feature to ask for technical assistance. You may download a PDF of the presentation at any time. Just look to the resources list that's to the right of the slide area. There are also a few other links in there to help you learn more about today's topic. Just click in there at any time, and the resource will open in a new browser tab, and you can save and read it after the webinar. At the end of the webinar, a brief survey will open in your browser, and it's also in the widgets below the slide area. And I'd greatly appreciate it if you would take a few moments to offer your feedback and to suggest other topics for us to cover. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be posted to AIIM.org's Resources Webinars page in just a few days. Right now, I'd like to introduce the speakers we have with us today. Neil Ward-Dutton is MWD Advisors co-founder and research director, and is one of Europe's most experienced and high-profile strategic IT advisors and industry analysts. His area of expertise includes digital transformation, business process management, integration technologies, low-code platforms, enterprise architecture, and IT strategy. Neil acts as an advisor to large European organizations across industries and sectors as diverse as financial services, retail, utilities, and government, as well as providing advice to a number of leading technology vendors. And we also have with us David Jeunesse, and David is a writer and public speaker who specializes in communicating the benefits of new technologies to business decision makers. At IBM, he develops messaging strategy, writes executive speeches and videos, and produces IBM live events. And prior to 2010, David performed a similar role with capture pioneer DataCap for 12 years. So right now, I am going to turn things over to Neil to begin our talk today. Neil?
Thanks so much, Teresa, and thank you so much to everybody for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to be speaking to you. So let's get started. Yeah, we're talking about the new workflow imperative. We're talking about how you put together a strategy that really links a lot of new automation technology choices into a coherent view of how the business is actually going to move forward. And so, I want to start actually, I'm going to move quite quickly through this first section, but I want to start by really explaining why we're here actually talking about this, because it becomes really, really important to remember what's really behind all of the stuff that's happening right now. And it's fundamentally one thing. It's abundance. So here we have graphs of how essentially the price performance of compute, of storage, and of connectivity have changed over the last few decades. And as you can see, in all three cases, the changes have been absolutely mind-blowing. Fundamentally, certainly when you compare it to, the 1980s, the 1990s, in all three of those categories, the comparative cost of these resources is kind of, to a rough approximation, free. And that has some very, very big effects when you think about what that does to the economics of computing, and then the economics of opportunity around computing. That does some very, very big things. One of the things it does is it creates competitor abundance for organizations. You know, if any of you work for banks, retailers, manufacturers, distributors, utilities, there's more and more competitors. And this is just it's not really meant to be read in detail. This is just, though, to show you that this is the financial services landscape in Holland, in the Netherlands. Yeah, so you can see there's like well over 100 small companies here nibbling away at the business models of the established banks. And if I drew the same chart for the UK, or for France, or for Germany, or for the US, or for Canada, or for Mexico, there would be different logos on here. So we're already seeing, you know, very, very significant sort of business and industry effects from this abundance in technology availability. And as I said, it's not just about banking. It's across logistics and distribution, retail, insurance, and so on and so on. There's disruption happening everywhere. And the reason it's happening is that the opportunity costs associated with entering new markets are, you know, ridiculously lower than they were just 10 years ago. Now, I'm sure in your organization, there is somebody somewhere talking about digital transformation. It may be top of the agenda, it may be slightly lower down the agenda, it may be something that is considered slightly further off, but it's kind of being talked about everywhere. And the reason I want to bring this up is that oftentimes when people get involved in thinking about, okay, how do we respond to this new competition? How do we actually respond to the new market reality that we're in? How do we meet people's expectations that are changing in such huge ways? Well, you know, when people think about digital transformation as a way to respond to this, they typically start by thinking about how to apply digital technology to the outside of their business, right? But that's only half of the story. So as I've shown here, you can think of digital transformation as being kind of like a four-quadrant affair. And different organizations will tend to focus in different areas. But by and large, we see organizations starting on the right-hand side. They're starting with how to change the way they manage and create external resources. So whether that's the customer experience or the supplier experience, or maybe they're creating some new digital products or a new digital network of some kind, that tends to be where people start, right? So you might say that it's the kind of digital outside. And that's not universally true, but it's very, very common. And that's fine, but you know what? It's only half the story. The real challenge is, what do we do beyond that? Because let me just illustrate the challenge with a very simple example. Let's say, for example, an organization says, okay, we're gonna really invest big. We want to really modernize the way we deliver customer experience. We want to create more personalized websites. We want to create a mobile app. We want to do much more on social channels, engage people through messaging platforms. That's all really super interesting, right? But fundamentally, it doesn't matter how cool your website is, how cool your mobile app is, whether you can, you know, reach people over messaging apps. That doesn't matter if what you can't also do is really help people when they get stuck or when they have a problem, or if you can't really onboard them effectively, or when you can't really kind of calculate their bill correctly, right? So when you think about an end-to-end customer experience, that's not only enabled by what happens in sales and marketing, what happens on kind of digital outside, it's also enabled by everything that happens inside your organization. So what we say is that, you know, it's fine to start with a digital outside, but it also has to be supported by a digital inside. And what I've tried to show here, the diagram's gone a little bit screwy, I apologize for that, is that all of these four different kind of domains of interest around digital, they're all connected and they all depend on each other. So it's super important to think about, okay, how do we use digital technologies not only to reinvent the way we engage with the outside world, but how to support that new engagement through the way we operate and the way we empower our employees. And really that's kind of my starting off point for today. Any organization that's serious about digital has to be thinking about how they can digitize operations and how they can use that to drive better, more empowered, more efficient, more effective employee experiences so that employees can deliver more value per person fundamentally. So we can scale the business faster, so we can be more agile. But you know what? Just as I talked about abundance in terms of raw technology, you think about cloud computing platforms, big data, and so on. Think about new competitors across industries. There's also abundance when it comes to thinking about how we're going to maybe digitize our operations. And this is just a silly picture I put together, but this is something that we find commonly in our community when we're talking to people about digitizing their operations, trying to connect those operations into the front end of their organization, right? Depending on who you talk to, depending on which vendors you might be listening to, RPA vendors will say, we have the answer. We will help you digitize the way your business works. We'll help you connect everything together and create new experiences for your employees and, delight your customers. And of course, also become more transparently compliant. BPM vendors will say the same. Integration platform as a service vendors, iPaaS vendors will probably say the same too, right? And if you have any specialist case management or decision management vendors you're talking to, same. Capture, that's clearly part of the story. Oh, don't even get me started on AI, right? I mean, AI is going to cure world hunger. It's going to secure world peace. It's going to do everything. And so on and so on and so on, right? Everywhere you turn, it seems that every corner of the tech industry is making a case for their technology to be the central pillar of how you respond to new expectations and new competition, right? So it's a challenging picture. And what I'm going to try and show you over the next 10 minutes or so is maybe how you can start to unpick some of that and build a strategy that really makes sense for the kind of work that is in your organization. All right. So let's zoom out a little bit, and I want to share some insights from the work we've done in our community. And fundamentally, what we're seeing is that when we get questions from our community and we do advisory sessions and workshops and so on, there tend to be three hotspots of interest. One is around, in the work that we do, which is really kind of expert work where there's a lot of discretion, a lot of highly trained people trying to resolve problems for customers or kind of investigate issues or really be quite creative in the work they're doing to resolve issues. How can we make those people more impactful? How can we really take some of the drudge work away from them? And how can we kind of supercharge their efforts? And a lot of the interest there is around AI. And so I have two axes here. One is work discretion, so the amount of kind of human expertise and discretion that goes into completing the work. Moving down and to the right, we then have another kind of big bubble of interest around low-code, app dev and workflow and integration platforms. How fundamentally the interest here is if we have people doing work where we know broadly speaking what the work looks like and how we need to get to the outcome that's kind of on the table, the result we need. But how can we really try and infuse that environment with best practices and really drive process quality, process predictability, and high performance throughout the organization? But what we don't want to do is kind of absolutely tie everything down so it's kind of procedurally perfect from top to bottom, because that's not how the real world works actually, and particularly not if we're trying to really give customers great experiences. We can't expect customers to always want to follow our own procedures. That way, that's a kind of road to bad outcomes. We don't really want to force customers into necessarily following the way that we want to work. We have to be flexible. We have to meet them where they want to be. So a lot of interest around how a new generation of workflow, integration, and app dev platforms play in there. And then thirdly, there's a whole extra piece of interest around RPA, robotic process automation, where we already know we have a whole bunch of work that gets done, which is really kind of programmatic already. It's highly procedural, highly routinized, highly predictable. We've got it kind of nailed down in terms of the detailed procedure of what needs to happen. And couldn't we just actually automate that work? Do we really need people to essentially act like robots to get that work done? So there's a third bubble of interest around RPA. And I apologize that this next chart is a little bit messy, and it's kind of intentionally messy. But when you zoom out again, what is really happening is that there's three types of work that people are interested in thinking about and applying technology to. And I'll very quickly explain them because this is kind of important. So again, starting kind of at the top, we talk about this kind of work where we need to apply a lot of discretion and a lot of creativity and latitude. We call that exploratory work. And that's work where you know what outcome you need to get to, but you probably don't know ahead of time exactly all the tasks and all the people who are going to need to get that work done. Transactional work is work where you by and large do know the structure of the work, the tasks that need to get done, and the decisions that need to get made, and you need to know, you already know as well broadly which roles are going to need to be played as that work progresses. But it's still not it's not really programmatic. There's still a lot of human discretion that needs to happen in fulfilling those individual tasks. And then at the bottom we have this programmatic work I've already mentioned briefly, where actually what we have is work that is already kind of robotic. It's just done by people, not by software. And what's really important about what we found in our community is that when you get people to start thinking about work in these three buckets, if you like, then what you start to realize is that you can apply automation technologies in different ways across these different kinds of work. And not all work is amenable to automation in the same way or to the same extent. And that's not really a function of where that work is in your organization or how senior the people are who do the work. It's actually about the nature of the work. And it's broadly speaking along the lines of these three different types. Okay, now I'm running fairly short on time, so I'm going to move through the next bits fairly quickly. I won't go through all the detail, but we can come back to this another time, or I can take questions offline if you want to go into the real detail. But it turns out that when you look at these different kinds of work and you come up with a kind of like an anatomical model of what work looks like, that different types of that work have different things which are typically prescribed and other things which are typically left up to the workers themselves as they're doing the work. And as I've just explained, exploratory work, you're not really defining much up front. At the other end of the scale, programmatic work, you're really prescribing everything up front. You're predefining everything. So let's quickly get into how different technologies really play a role here. When you zoom into that anatomy of work and you're thinking about programmatic work, well, you know, RPA is a really great place to start. It's particularly unattended RPA, which is kind of, you could think of it as headless, sits in the background. You have robots working as humans would work through legacy systems, UIs, to mimic how people work. That's a great way to encode individual tasks, to drive the flow and assignment of that work through different screens and different applications. But that's not the be-all and end-all. What I'm trying to show you here is that RPA could well be the core of what you want to do here, but it may not be everything. And what's one of the things that's particularly interesting, and we find it in our community more and more as people drive RPA programs, is they start to be interested in complementing this with intelligent capture and AI services. So that's really looking at the left-hand side of our diagram. It's kind of supercharging our ability to automate making sense of inputs and triggers. So making sense of electronic documents like PDFs, emails, maybe even digitized handwritten notes or text messages. Actually making sense of all that content, extracting key data, and then essentially kind of automating some of the upstream processing that can only be driven downstream into the core of the automated engine, which could be RPA. It could actually alternatively be an integration platform if you have more API-driven back-end systems you want to work with. But again, you also may find as you scale up, you should actually bring some other complementary pieces in here too. Decision management is a great one, where you start to encode more complex decision-making into your bots. And typically find you bump up against the edge of what RPA is really good for. And then it makes sense to actually externalize that decision logic and use a specialized platform to do it. Similar kind of story when we look at transactional work. And remember, this is work where, as the pink pieces show here, we kind of know upfront what our goal is, and we probably know pretty much the whole way along what the flow of the work needs to be, what the tasks are, and how the work needs to be assigned. But here again, we can really add value, particularly where the volume of the work is high, in using intelligent capture and complementary AI services to make sense of inputs, particularly document inputs, stuff that comes over digital channels or is digitized in a kind of digital mailroom kind of scenario, so that we can triage that work and we can really move the automation upstream, and we can actually be much more accurate in how we're automating the work end to end. What we can also do is use attended mode RPA, which is where we have bots sitting on workers' desktops and providing kind of smart assists to workers as they're working through tasks to help them update data in kind of maybe multiple back-end systems that need to be updated at the end of a process. So again, it's not just about where you might think of starting, which is in many cases workflow. That's probably going to be the backbone of what you do here. But there's a role for intelligent capture and AI services. There's a role for decision management. There's a role for attended RPA as well, quite possibly. And lastly, when you come to exploratory work, often the backbone that you might want to employ here is going to be a case management piece. But again, that's not the be-all and end-all. Again, there's an opportunity, particularly where you have cases driven by lots of external documentation, to use, again, that intelligent capture and AI service technology that's around. There's the ability, the opportunity to use attended RPA again, so that we can rapidly update back-end legacy systems as we're moving through a case or as we're closing a case down. We can use predictive machine learning models to actually drive next best action. So to make recommendations to our expert workers about who should you be working with to solve this problem? What kinds of guidance document or contract should I be bringing into this case so that you understand exactly how to resolve it? Or what kind of decision needs to be made here based on what we know about cases in history that have similar features? All of these things can be driven as kind of augmentations, smart assists for your human workers. So again, although case management may be the core of what you want to do, there's absolutely value to be added around the edges of that case management kind of core. And really where I'm going with this is that this is another way in which kind of, abundance is really affecting things. When we look at how automation technology platforms are changing, fundamentally, they're becoming faster, cheaper, easier, and they're reaching into more places. Yeah, so they're solving more problems in more varied ways. So it's not just about the stuff that we did 10 years ago, which was typically big upfront investment, a lot of design required upfront, required a lot of deep technology expertise, very much about, in many cases, kind of back office and core business process automation and so on. Now we're seeing much more agile, open, collaborative platforms offered as subscriptions, very cheaply in some cases, able to attack much more varied problems, particularly when you bring AI and predictive technologies into the mix, able to not just do kind of straight automation, but actually drive augmentation and intelligent assistance into the work that gets done. So faster, cheaper, easier, and available in more ways in more places. And really the big takeaway is, hopefully what I've laid out to you, I've covered a lot of ground very quickly, and it's probably been a little bit confusing, but that's kind of okay, because what the real message I want you to take away is that it is confusing, and so you have to have a strategy. You can't just, as I was saying to someone the other day, you can't just kind of let 1,000 flowers bloom, let organizational teams go off and do their own thing and just explore and try things out. You can do that, but for goodness sake, have a gardening plan, right? If you're going to let all these flowers bloom, you need some kind of strategy that enables you to clearly make and then communicate decisions about where you're using which technologies and why. And the framework I very quickly showed you through over the last few slides is hopefully a way that you can get started in doing that. So the tech is changing rapidly. There's actually multiple moving parts that you need to think about. So you need to have a clear strategy that you can communicate that shows how and why and where you're using certain technologies. And with that, I shall hand over to David.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you so much, Neil. And, you know, when you have to follow someone as brilliant as Neil, you have to think creatively. So I decided to start with Einstein. And so Einstein, before he died, was searching for what he called a unified field theory. And that's a way to connect relativity and electromagnetism. Sort of this, all of the primal forces of the universe into a single working theory. Well, he didn't get it done, and that work continues. But I think it's a good metaphor for what today's business organizations are trying to do. They're trying to connect all of their disparate systems and find a better way to operate, to eliminate silos, to improve processes, to engage with customers, and maybe even to monitor and report and to get insight from their processes. So a lot like Einstein, that is IBM's strategy. And what I'm showing you here is an image that represents how the digital business automation business unit for IBM has organized its portfolio. And you can see a lot of the elements that Neil has just covered. Tasks is robots. Content is our ECM, our repositories, and all of the services that go along with that. Workflow is the focus of what we're talking about today, and decisions is really business rules. And you can see data capture across the top could impact and affect just about all of those, and it sits on a platform that you could do that reporting and intelligence and health monitoring. And of course, we can put it on cloud, in hybrid, or on-prem. And across the top, the vision is a unified user experience that enables a single environment to be able to move back and forth. So really, that's about the only public service announcement about IBM I want to do, but I want to explain that this unified field vision is something that can help get, you know, where Neil has just been telling us. The first place that this integration benefits users is in a new offering that IBM introduced in March called the IBM Business Automation Workflow, which combines the best of IBM BPM and Case Manager. And these are two long-time products that a lot of customers have. And of course, our customers all unanimously said, hey, what took you so long? But here's what they mean. Workflow is not just one thing. And I think we've just picked that up from Neil. This is a little bit of a variation on Neil's slide with work discretion on the left and work volume on the right. But, you know, he's from United Kingdom, so he puts work discretion on the left. Here it's on the right. The idea is that there's a spectrum of workflow that could go from what we call straight-through processing on the left, and that is those predictable, those linear, those business processes that can be modeled and that aren't going to change rapidly, and we can get sort of a no-touch workflow where humans really are not involved. And as you move to the right, you might have a variation where you have a process worker and you have business process management operating together, perhaps some levers and decision points. And as you move all the way to the right, then you have knowledge workers working within a case management environment where they have a lot of leeway to kick off different workflows or to accomplish tasks or perhaps to collaborate with experts, as Neil pointed out. I need some legal advice on this decision. I need an investigator to tell me something, and so forth. So you have really a complete spectrum, and the whole idea of the business automation workflow product is they're all connected. It's got everything in one product, so you can determine based on the process where you want to go. Let's continue to look at perhaps those three. Of course, it's a little bit more nuanced than that, but let's think about in green those areas that are in the middle where a process worker and some automation work together. In blue, they're pretty much straight through. They're just process-centric. And then the purple are those areas with a lot of ad hoc tasks and ad hoc type decisions that have to be made, so a case management environment. And you can see here, in insurance, your claims processing is pretty much a joint type of workflow. Your underwriting, a lot of that can be programmed ahead of time and determined and automated. But when you get into investigations and human beings doing investigations and exploration, you're going to need more of a human environment to be able to do this. So as you see in healthcare, and I've got some good examples from IBM customers that have come and talked at our conferences that I'll share with you of some of these. But you can see across many different industries, there are these types of different varieties of workflow. And again, the spectrum from straight through all the way to very, very complex human interactions. So let's get into some of the areas where workflow connects with other automation tools. And again, Neil has covered this nicely. Workflow with robotics, as I say, we call that tasks. A workflow could kick off some robots. Robots could kick off or trigger a workflow. So that kind of goes two ways. Workflow and content, also very, very key there. So as a business process goes through, perhaps it's updating a document, updating an agreement, in some way continuing to impact the repository, and or pulling from the repository information the workflow needs to get work done. So these sort of content centric workflows are quite common in all of those industries that we just looked at. And then business rules or decisions. That is a natural to be combined with workflow, and I have a very good example coming up to talk about within banking about how that works. And of course, capture and workflow. And so you could see a process, perhaps a mortgage process, where you need to capture some extra documents to be able to approve the mortgage that weren't there in the initial package, and you can bring it right in and get to work. Or a capture could kick off a workflow based on the document that's been captured. So there's a lot of different ways that these different automation tools work together. And I think that's our main takeaway today here, is to talk about this approach that requires all of these tools working together. So here's an example, and it is the Dutch tax office, and they get about 4.5 million tax disputes a year. And so that means some citizen saying this is not the right amount, or I want to push back. Some of them are very complex, some of them are very simple. They had about 10,000 people dealing with this problem, and with automation, using a lot of different tools together, and I'll show you how that works in a minute, they got almost down to a quarter of that. So one of the benefits, of course, is that at the end of a process like this, all of the decisions made, all of the steps taken, and what was communicated is wrapped up and zipped up into a record. So now we have an audit trail to be able to talk about what happened during that decision, and we're able to speed up this process, make it more accurate, and now citizens also can digitally file an objection. Let's take a look at a little process diagram, kind of what it looks like. So the dispute comes in, and there perhaps is some kind of corroborating information or some document that supports the dispute, so we are able to capture that. At a certain point, the decisions kicks in to say, well, this one's an easy one, we see a lot of these, let's go to straight through processing on the top. Or this is a little bit more complex, we may need some BPM with a process worker, or this one is really complex, we need a knowledge worker and case management. They're able to collaborate with Office 365, and then, of course, it all sits on an IBM content repository. So here is an excellent example of how all of these automation tools are required to come up with this outcome. Now let's segue from government to financial services and PNC Bank. So PNC Bank got into the automation business 8 or 9 years ago. They've been on this journey, and like a lot of banks, they are transforming themselves into the digital bank, and using automation to do that. So what they've done is blend together business rules and workflow sitting on top of a content repository. So one of the areas we can see this really working is in their consumer lending area. And after all consumer lending institutions need to review their loans after closing to determine that there's no bias and that the loan approval was based solely on facts. This is one of the regulations banks follow. So they used to have to do 100% of the loans. They would have to review with a human being going through and making those determinations. But with automation and with workflow and business rules, handling it all, with that audit trail available, the bank really only had to now review about 10 to 20% of the loans that had some exception where the rules and the workflow weren't able to automatically do it. So here, you've whittled way down the amount of manual work that needs to be done. And so that was, I think, proof that PNC needed, all they needed to build a business case. And now they have millions of business rules now running across about 50 different line of business applications and keyed together, orchestrated by workflow, sitting on top of content. So, for example, when PNC picked up all the U.S. branches of Royal Bank of Canada, they were able to just apply their automated approach without adding staff. So there you've got your productivity at scale, right in action. And that's the holy grail for a lot of operations professionals. Let's take one more look at a healthcare example. And that would be Ottawa Hospital. And of course, hospitals today are struggling with an interesting paradox that as healthcare improves, with better diagnostic tools and treatments, hospitals are seeing more complex and complicated conditions. So patients with complex conditions, they require care from multiple departments. So how do we get all these departments to work together better? It's like a variation on that silo problem. And so they built a care process management platform that integrates decisions, rules, workflow, and sits on content. So one element that's easy to understand is the patient admitting. So patients in the emergency room, they say, well, we're going to have to keep you overnight. We're going to have to keep you. And there's a process of connecting with a hospital department doctor. So the emergency doctor has to talk to them. Well, if that goes on more than, say, 20 minutes and they haven't had a consultation, it kicks off a workflow and it gets escalated until that thing happens. And they're able to get a patient admitted. I mean, imagine if you're sitting there with a friend or a relative and you're waiting to get a room and you're in the emergency room. It's not a great place to be. You want to speed that up. And so that's what they were able to do with this combination of workflow and rules, and shows a great example. And they're doing it in many different areas of the hospital, admissions and patient flow and appointments and all the different areas of operations in a hospital. So I have actually gone over my time by a minute or two, and I want to close by saying you can learn more about the IBM Business Automation workflow at this link here, where there's some demos and some more customer case stories and things along those lines. And I know some questions have come in, so let's go back to Teresa and we can address some of these questions.
Sure thing. And we've been listening to David Jeunesse from IBM, and before that we were listening to Neil Ward-Dutton from MWD Advisors. And I just hope that these different ways and opportunities for how to look at process in this very large topic area, and hoping we've been able to help shed some light on where you need to move next. So, and also this link for this IBM Business Automation workflow, that is in the resources section. So if you click on that, and that'll open in another browser tab, and you can check that out after the event. And we do have questions that are rolling in, and do want to get to these. And the first one we actually have a couple of questions that came in a similar vein. and so I want to first direct this to Neil, and essentially it's asking about artificial intelligence and workflow coming together. Someone even very kindly wrote out a very detailed question asking Neil, how do you see these different technologies growing together with like AI-powered robots that can do everything? You know, the programmed work, assisting the experts, executing the complex decision rules, you know, talking to the systems via screens and APIs, the control of a workflow, and realizing that we don't have another whole hour just to talk on that topic alone. But Neil, your thoughts on this?
Okay, yeah. So yeah, specifically the question was, yeah, will all these technologies grow together? Maybe, you know, we might get AI-powered robots that can kind of do everything. They can do some programmed work. They can assist experts. They can execute complex decision rules. You know, and yes, I think it's absolutely possible. But I think that what will have happened in order for that to be possible is that fundamentally they will have kind of they will have taken on the characteristics of all the other technologies we talked about. So to the questioner, this is really, it's actually kind of another way to look at it is about kind of markets colliding, or different technologies kind of different vendors kind of adopting different technologies. And I guess what's kind of interesting about the whole RPA thing, the whole RPA movement phenomenon, if you like, is that it is as much about packaging and marketing as it is about technology. And so the RPA vendors talk about, in quotes, training robots. Really what you're doing is programming, you know, programming a service to run. It's, you know, that's technically what you're actually doing, right? You may be kind of doing drag and drop modeling, but you're not really training in most cases. But it's a way of packaging and marketing their technology that really makes sense to business and particularly to operations people. Now, what I think we can already see some of those vendors, the RPA vendors, doing is expanding out the repertoire of what they're doing through those, in quotes, robots. They're taking on more kind of integration responsibility, starting to be able to orchestrate decisions and certain sort of business logic services. But I think if that technology kind of grows in scope, it will essentially start to encompass many aspects of what other tools do. So it's at that point it really becomes more a matter of how the technology is packaged rather than the technology fundamentally being different to how it is today. I don't know if that really answers the question, but fundamentally I'm saying yes, I think it is possible, but that's really more about how the technology is packaged and how the vendors might essentially acquire each other or partner with each other than it is fundamentally about a new technology.
Thanks, Neil. And I have a next question here, and I'd like to direct that over to David. And someone's asking, knowing that there's different and multiple workflow BPM engines in an enterprise with the different systems that organizations have, what do you recommend for a process control when that work object is traveling in and out of different systems as it goes through its work? What kind of decision logic system? Your thoughts on this, or how to guide this?
Wow, well, that's a huge topic because you're talking about sort of federation of all your different business process engines and the silo problem again. So there's a lot of different, I've seen a lot of efforts on companies' behalf saying we're going to standardize because we can't, all these different systems don't talk to each other. We need to standardize on one particular product. That's happening a lot now. We're being called into those kinds of opportunities because it really is a problem. So is that an answer to this balkanization of business process engines? It's a really tough one. It is, I don't know if Neil, you've seen the world from a non-vendor, vantage point. Have you found a single unified field theory for many different process engines?
Well, I've come across big banks that have kind of 3, 4, 5 BPM systems,
exactly.
and that's even after some rationalization, right? So there is a point at which I think, it really comes down to business cases fundamentally, right? So you can get by with a kind of stitched together kind of system which will pass events back and forth between different systems and data in those events, and so you can create synchronizations and all that kind of good stuff. But it's still a nightmare to manage and govern, because you can bet that each of those platforms is owned by a different team, and they have their own particular way that they like to manage it and make changes. You can bet that there's really no visibility of the work across those platforms. And so, to an extent that is tolerable, but if you're really serious about driving improvement end to end, then you need to make some hard decisions. And I think the kind of case for having lots of different systems participate in those end-to-end flows, it becomes really challenging if you're really looking at kind of customer experience supporting processes, because you just won't really, it's going to be very hard for you to get the kind of visibility that I think is so important. And I think that, like you said earlier, David, it's important when you're thinking about digitization. It's not just about automation, it's actually about visibility too, because it's only through visibility that you actually get insight that you can use to drive further innovation and improvement. So there's a kind of closed loop you're aiming for here, and with a fragmented operating environment, it's super hard to really get that working.
Well, thanks, Neil and David. I appreciate your insights here. And I just wanted to let everybody know that AIIM is offering a special discount on our online training courses. And so if you go to aim.org/training, and you can learn about our brand new emerging technologies program, as well as the other programs that we have on SharePoint and Office 365, Modern Records Management. Yes, we do have one on BPM and governance, and there are others. So if you purchase any of these online programs before the end of this week, June 30th, you'll receive a 40% discount off of the price, and that's with that code SUMMER18. And all of that's at aim.org/training, so I do invite you to check that out. And this is our big summer sale, so I invite you to take advantage of that. And since we are at the end of our webinar time, we have recorded things and will be available in a day or two back to the AIM website. Don't forget to download the resources. Greatly appreciate it if you would take that survey that's in the widgets across the bottom. I do value your feedback. And I very much want to thank our underwriter, IBM. Without the support from our solution providers, AIM would not be able to bring you these free educational programs like our webinar. So IBM, thank you so much for your sponsorship. And as we bring our webinar to a close, I just want to leave you with our speakers' closing thoughts or key takeaways from everything we've discussed today. So I'm going to begin first with Neil Ward-Dutton of MWD Advisors. Your closing thoughts.
Well, thanks, Teresa. I'll keep it really short and sweet. There's a whole load of stuff going on. It's really super important that as somebody who has an influence or an interest in driving automation in your business, you really take time to explore the variety of what's actually going on. Don't just look at the kind of the stuff that's easy to immediately kind of trial or something like that. So don't just look straight at RPA or workflow. Those are great places to start, but it's also really important to understand what's going on with predictive technologies, with AI, with intelligent capture, all of those pieces. And then, as you start to really unpick the variety of stuff that's going on, try and put together some kind of decision-making framework. It doesn't have to be the one that I very quickly showed you. It could be something else, but try and come up with a consistent way of mapping all this out so you can see where it makes sense to apply different technologies, and crucially, so that you can then communicate that to others. Because if you don't do that, you will get chaos and it will go bad.
Thank you, Neil. And David Janess of IBM, your closing thoughts today.
Well, I'm going to try to sum up what I think Neil and I have both been saying in different ways, and that is that digital transformation is not about technology, it's about people. and it's about culture. And the technology is, yes, it's a part of it, and it's changing fast. It's getting easier to work with. It's getting easier to design and deploy. It's getting more tightly integrated. But now it's up to people to figure out their version of the digital workplace. That is the creative part. I think that's the fascinating part. I get to talk to IBM customers about how they're doing it. I've told a few stories today. I can't wait to see what the AIIM community does with these tools and how they put them together. And I look forward to what you all create.
Thank you, David. And thank you, everyone, for your time today. For AIIM, this is Teresa Resick, and we will see you on our next webinar. And have a great afternoon.